Please be seated. We have, in this Old Testament story, this amazing moment of loyalty and friendship in the relationship that's given to us between Naomi and Ruth. This needs to be set in the context of the society in which women lived, in which Naomi and Ruth are having to deal and being defined as women in their culture and in their world. For us to be able to understand the power of what they were doing out of love. In the time that they're living, the recognition of women in society was about the lowest you could be on, the lowest rung of that social ladder. They had no status. This is difficult to get across right now in our society as women in Western culture have spent a couple of generations now, a few generations, on the backs of suffragettes and on and on through history. We have come to a place, and continuing to go, for empowerment, social and culture. But hearing a time and a place where women are utterly dependent on the men in their family, a man to represent them. A man to represent them in all cases of law, when anything comes up, any injustice at all. They cannot speak on their own behalf, as an advocate of their own behalf. They cannot even be their own witness at any trial. They must be represented, their voice is always represented by a man. So the man that they're attached to, be that a husband, a brother, a son, is their lawyer. They cannot, if they are ill or suffering, approach the temple to approach a rabbi for healing by themselves. They must be accompanied and represented by a man in their family. Women cannot have health care without a man to represent them to their physician. You cannot approach for healing on your own. Another piece is they cannot have income of their own, but must belong to a family unit represented by a man that cannot do business on their own, except in very extraordinary circumstances. But the majority of women are dependent on the men for all income and access to income. You cannot have a job unless you are represented by a man. You cannot have food unless you are represented by a man. You cannot own property unless you are represented by a man. And even when you are, it's not yours. You live in that house, you take care of it, you do everything for it. It's not yours. It's never yours. Now, there's a wonderful thing my Russian professor used to say as we would talk about things in Soviet era Russia, or where have things gone in society and culture all across the planet. And she had this saying that her mother used to share with her, which was, it is true that man is the head in many of these places. But it is also true that woman is the neck that turns the head. And indeed, what we have that is, if you will, salvation-oriented and redemptive in this story of Ruth, is when we look between the lines of what's going on, there's a tremendous piece of empowerment. The story of Ruth starts out where basically Elimelech, who is the husband to Naomi, and they have two sons, Mahon and Chittim. And there is a bit of a drought going on and a famine in the area where they're from, which is Bethlehem. So Elimelech and Naomi decided they must immigrate to a place where there might be the opportunity for employment and a way out, because they're farmers, they own land in the Bethlehem area, and with the drought going on, they're unable to make a living. So they migrated with their two sons Mahon and Chilion, and go to the area of the Moabites. While they're there, the two sons marry women, Orpah and Ruth. Now, Chilion and Mahon die. So does the Leland. All three women now have no man to represent them as a family unit at all. What will they do? How will they live? Because they will not without that representation. So Orpah decides she will stay, go back to her original family unit, and perhaps her father or brother or someone else becomes her economic assurance. However, Ruth, confronted with the same reality, decides to put her lot in with Naomi because she loves Naomi. She decides not to return to her own people and some financial security there. But here's what's really interesting. You know how it's very common in many fables to make it really evident who the bad guy is or the good guy is by the name that they have? If you translate Chilion and Mahon, the names of Naomi's sons, they translate to mean sickly and weak. It's my son, sickly. My other son, weak. So we know right away they're being alerted to something that they're not thought much of. right away. They cook. Okay. So things are wrong. Women cannot depend on sickly and weak men to represent them. So they're looking for better representation there. They go back to the Bethlehem area to seek out some of Naomi's kin. Naomi is not able to even go into the fields for herself. Something is going on for her that she herself is not able to glean. Gleaning was a tradition that those who were landed had of allowing the very poor who were not landed to be able to come to the very edges and take what had not been harvested on the edges of fields. And Naomi goes to glean, to make use of this. But she goes to some kin of Naomi's. It's a field owned by kin. Now, there was a practice at the time that one of the ways that the men could assure that they could retain any land in the family was that if a man died without leaving a living son, then that man's brother or other male relative could marry his widow. It wasn't about getting